On an 11-acre parcel at the corner of 9th Avenue North and Ocean Boulevard in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, sits a lot enclosed by chain link fencing, a few hundred feet from a coastline that pulls in roughly 18 million visitors a year. For 58 years, from 1948 until September 30th, 2006, this exact patch of sand held one of the most recognizable amusement parks on the eastern seaboard: 36 rides, 3 roller coasters, a 2,000-capacity dance hall, and a 1912 carousel with zebras, lions, and dragons where the horses should have been. Then it closed. A zip line went up on the empty ground in the years after, ran for a while, and then in 2024 closed too. As of early 2026, the only serious proposal for the site is a music venue that exists on paper, discussed in city council briefings, not yet under construction. This is the physical center of the town's own origin story. The ground where the first pavilion stood in 1908, where the first hotel opened in 1901, and for nearly 2 decades in a resort market that books more than 6 million hotel room nights a year and pulls in over $13 billion in visitor spending annually, it has been the single least productive piece of oceanfront real estate in the city. Not because nobody wants it, because nobody, for 20 years, could agree on what it was worth. Every chapter of this story follows the same pattern. Something saves Myrtle Beach. That thing makes it rich, and then that same thing becomes the force that hollows it out. A timber company that thought it was selling turpentine ends up selling sand. A Chicago financier who comes for the land stays for the leisure economy that land makes possible. A military base that anchors the local payroll for 4 decades gets shut down by Washington, and the town builds something better in its place. A single amusement park becomes so central to the town's identity that closing it, even quietly, even for sound financial reasons, leaves a hole nobody has filled 20 years later. Myrtle Beach was never supposed to be a town. It was accumulated almost by accident out of land nobody particularly wanted, by men chasing an entirely different resource. Every fortune this place has made has come from something that was, at some earlier point, considered worthless. The question this story keeps circling, asked in nearly identical language across 8 decades of local newspapers, is a simple one. Has Myrtle Beach finally run out of things it didn't know it had? The sand under Myrtle Beach is geologically young by the standards of the Carolina coastal plain, built up over roughly the last 2 million years as the Atlantic shoreline advanced and retreated across the region, again and again through the Pleistocene's alternating ice ages, leaving behind the flat, low barrier island geography that would eventually become the Grand Strand. For most of human habitation here, none of that mattered, because nobody particularly wanted to live on it. The area's first known inhabitants were the Waccamaw and Winyah peoples, recorded as having called the broader region Chicora, the land, though documented specifics about their settlements along this exact stretch of coast are scarce. What survives are arrowheads and pottery shards turned up by construction crews centuries later, rather than a written record. A footpath used by these communities, later widened into what colonists called King's Highway, ran roughly along the route that Highway 17 follows today, connecting the northern colonies to Charleston and Savannah. But it moved people through this stretch of coast, not to it. When European colonists arrived in the surrounding region in the 18th century, they went around this particular patch of shoreline, not through it. The Georgetown district to the south, cut off from Horry County by rivers and swamp, became one of the most productive rice-growing regions in North America, producing nearly half the United States' entire rice crop by 1840, and making Georgetown the largest rice-exporting port on Earth. Horry County got none of that wealth. Bounded by the Waccamaw River, the PD, and the ocean, walled off from the plantation economy to its south, it developed in near total isolation, so separate from the rest of the state that residents took to calling it the Independent Republic of Horry, not entirely as a joke. The land itself offered little to explain the neglect. Swamp, scrub pine, and sand, subject to hurricanes that periodically erased whatever had been built on it. A storm in the early 19th century is said to have swept an entire plantation household into the sea near what was then called Long Bay, drowning everyone inside, though this may be legend rather than documented fact. What the region did have was timber and turpentine, harvested by hard-working farmers and naval stores distillers who had no reason to think the empty beach a few miles from their sawmills was worth anything at all. The company that would eventually own most of this coastline began in 1895 as a business partnership with no interest in tourism whatsoever. Franklin Gorham Burroughs, born in 1834 in Williamston, North Carolina, had moved to Horry County as a young man to clerk in a relative's store rather than farm his father's land, and by the 1880s he and a partner, Benjamin Greer Collins, had built a modest empire out of timber and turpentine, formalizing the Burroughs and Collins Company in 1895 and gradually accumulating some 70,000 acres of coastal pine forest and swamp for what amounted to pocket change, land nobody else wanted, bought for its lumber, not its location. Burroughs died in 1897, 2 years after the partnership he'd built was formalized, and never lived to see a single paying guest walk through a door his company built. That fell to his sons and his widow. In 1900, the company built a short logging railroad from Conway to the coast, a spur line meant to haul out timber that, almost as an afterthought, could also carry passengers. The following year, 1901, the same year, 3 states to the north, J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie were finalizing a $480 million deal to form United States Steel. Burroughs and Collins opened its first hotel on that same stretch of coast, the Seaside Inn, and began selling the surrounding oceanfront lots for $25 apiece, roughly $900 today, with a strange sweetener attached. Buy a lot, build a house worth at least $500 on it, about $18,000 in today's money, and the company would throw in a second lot for free. That same year, the settlement finally got a name. It had been called Long Bay, then Withers, then simply Newtown, until the local paper ran a contest and Mrs. F.E. Burroughs, the founder's widow, submitted the winning entry, Myrtle Beach, after the wax myrtle shrubs growing wild along the dunes. Nobody involved in naming it believed they were founding a city. The man who turned that raw land into a functioning resort economy arrived from somewhere else entirely, which is the case in almost every version of this story. Simeon Brooks Chapin was born on May 31, 1865 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Emery David Chapin and Marietta Armour Chapin, a name that connected him, at least by blood, to the Chicago meatpacking dynasty whose brand still sits in supermarket freezers today. He was raised and schooled in Chicago, and in 1883, at 18, he went to work at Armour and Company itself, learning the mechanics of commodities and capital from inside one of the largest businesses in America. 9 years later, in 1892, he struck out on his own as a banker and broker, and by 1901 he had formed his own firm, S.B. Chapin and Company, with offices in both Chicago and on Wall Street. By 1906, he had moved his family to a residence on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, in the same stretch of block where the tower at 930 Fifth Avenue stands today, and had secured a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. He was, in other words, about as far from Horry County, South Carolina, as an American businessman of his era could be. He first saw Myrtle Beach around 1911 on what appears to have been a casual visit and recognized immediately what the Burroughs family had never had the capital to exploit. A hotel, a rail spur, and thousands of acres of cheap land were worthless as a resort without money behind them to build roads, lodging, and reasons for people to come. In 1912, he bought a half interest in the family's coastal holdings, pairing his cash against the Burroughs family's land in a new venture called Myrtle Beach Farms Company, which controlled just under 66,000 acres and set about developing them through farming, forestry, and increasingly real estate. The economics were straightforward and, for the next 3 decades, extremely effective. Chapin's money paid for infrastructure the Burroughs heirs could never have financed alone, and every dollar of new tourism revenue increased the value of the land the family still owned outright. He ran the operation for close to 30 years, retiring in 1941 and turning his attention to philanthropy, funding schools, churches, hospitals, and YMCAs through a foundation that, by 2005 alone, had already distributed some $15 million, worth considerably more than that today, to institutions in a town where he never permanently lived. He died on January 6, 1945, at his home in Pinehurst, North Carolina, and was buried not in Horry County, but on the grounds of his family estate on Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, alongside a wife and children who spent their winters in Myrtle Beach and their summers everywhere else. In 3 decades of shaping the town more decisively than almost anyone else in its history, Simeon Chapin never once became, in any meaningful sense, a resident of it. When the modern parent company took its current name in 1990, Burroughs and Chapin, it fused the founding timber family with the outsider whose money had actually built the resort, an arrangement of credit that mirrors, almost exactly, how the town itself came to exist. Local land, outside capital, and a permanent asymmetry between who owned the ground and who made it valuable. What Chapin's capital and the Burroughs family's land produced over the following decades was a business model almost embarrassingly simple. Sell an inexpensive beach vacation to a domestic, mostly southern and midwestern, drive-in market with no particular interest in flying anywhere and no reason to leave the country. Unlike Florida's resort towns, which built themselves around railroads and later around jet airports, Myrtle Beach built itself around the automobile and the 2-lane highway, and every improvement to that highway system translated almost directly into visitor growth. By the late 1930s, new bridges across the rivers that had isolated Horry County for 2 centuries opened the coast to middle-class families with cars, and the company that had once sold turpentine pivoted hard toward mass-market tourism aimed at people who could drive down for a week rather than take a steamship for a season. The numbers, once they started moving, moved fast. The town incorporated in 1938 and became an official city in 1957. From a population that barely cleared 1,000 residents at incorporation, Myrtle Beach and its surrounding Grand Strand grew into one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the entire United States by the turn of the 21st century, adding residents and hotel rooms at a pace few American beach towns have ever matched. Golf became its own parallel boom on top of tourism. Between 1980 and 2001 alone, 87 new golf courses opened along the Grand Strand, pushing the total past 114 courses by 2002. A figure so large that Myrtle Beach could plausibly claim, and did claim, to be the golf capital of the world, a 15-minute drive containing more 18-hole courses than entire states. Every course sold real estate around it, as much as it sold golf. Developers understood, correctly, that a fairway view could add tens of thousands of dollars to the price of an adjacent house, worth considerably more in today's inflated housing market. And so courses kept opening even as the actual number of rounds played each year stayed almost perfectly flat. Hotel and motel construction followed the same growth-for-growth's sake logic along Ocean Boulevard, and by the early 2000s, the region supported tens of thousands of accommodation units, a lodging inventory roughly comparable, room for room, to Las Vegas. The business model worked precisely because almost nobody who came here needed a passport, a plane ticket, or a translator, and precisely because the supply of new beds, new fairways, and new attractions kept expanding to meet a demand that nobody had actually measured. What happens to all that supply once demand stops keeping pace is the part of this story most visitors never learn about, and it explains almost everything that comes later. If stories like this one interest you, subscribe to the channel before we go on. By the 1950s and into the 1970s, Ocean Boulevard on a summer night smelled like a specific, unrepeatable combination of copper tone, frying dough, and cigarette smoke drifting out of open convertibles cruising the strip bumper to bumper. Radios tuned to the same 3 or 4 beach music stations. Teenagers in saddle shoes and later in cutoffs did the shag, a stylized, low-to-the-ground partner dance born on this stretch of coast, up and down the pavilion's oceanfront boardwalk and inside its 2,000-capacity dance pavilion, where acts including Jerry Lee Lewis and the Temptations played to crowds that spilled out onto Ocean Boulevard itself. The pavilion's Magic Attic arcade ran mechanical novelty machines where a rabbit would climb a small ladder and kiss a painted face, and a duck in a tiny vest would peck out a tune on a miniature piano, alongside pinball machines and, later, some of the first video games most vacationing families had ever seen. The Herschel-Silman Carousel spun its passengers on frogs, zebras, lions, and dragons rather than horses, with a single ornately decorated lead horse standing out among the menagerie, a genuine oddity even by amusement park standards, and it is, remarkably, still running today. Because of a peculiar quirk of South Carolina law that lasted from the years after Prohibition until New Year's Day 2006, bars along the boulevard were legally required to pour liquor exclusively from miniature airline-style bottles rather than from full-sized ones behind the bar, a rule that gave Myrtle Beach, for decades, an odd, unearned reputation for serving some of the strongest mixed drinks in the entire country, because bartenders simply cracked open a second or third tiny bottle rather than measure a proper pour. Families ate boiled shrimp and hush puppies at oceanfront restaurants, bought saltwater taffy from shops that had occupied the same storefronts for generations, and had their photographs taken in front of the Astro Needle, a 200-foot observation tower that once stood across the street from the pavilion and drew crowds purely on the strength of its height. Newspapers, the Sun News chief among them, chronicled beauty pageants, fishing tournament winners, and the annual Sun Fun Festival with the seriousness other cities reserved for elections. None of it felt temporary to the people living through it. Generations of Grand Strand families were born in the local hospital, married at the pavilion or one of the oceanfront churches nearby, and were eventually buried in Horry County cemeteries a few miles from the beach where they had spent every summer of their lives entirely certain that the town around them, built out of turpentine money and a Chicago financier's capital, was simply how things were and always would be. Here's the thing about Myrtle Beach at its peak that deserves to be said plainly, because it explains everything that came after. Almost none of what made the town rich was actually scarce. A beach is not a copper vein or an oil field. There is no finite deposit to exhaust, which sounds like an advantage until you understand what it actually means, which is that there was never a natural ceiling on supply, only on demand. Anyone with capital and a plat map could build another hotel, another golf course, another strip of souvenir shops. And for most of the 20th century, enough new visitors kept arriving to absorb it. But a resort economy built entirely on continuously expanding supply, chasing a customer base that grows more slowly than the beds built to house it, is a structure with a mathematical flaw sitting inside it from day one, invisible as long as growth continues, and catastrophic the moment it stops. Nobody living through the boom years experienced it that way. They experienced record hotel occupancy, rising land values, and a business community that treated every new fairway and every new high-rise as evidence of unstoppable momentum. The golf industry alone would eventually prove the point with brutal clarity, opening courses through the 1980s and 1990s at a pace nearly 3 times faster than the number of annual rounds played was actually growing, and nobody involved slowed down to ask what would happen once the arithmetic finally caught up with the land. The first catastrophe arrived on December 28, 1944, when fire burned the original pavilion to the ground, reportedly started by locals building small warming fires underneath its elevated wooden floor during a cold snap. An almost absurdly modest cause for the total loss of the town's central gathering place. It was rebuilt within 4 years, reopening in 1948 as the amusement park generations would remember, because the economics of a beach town without a boardwalk centerpiece simply didn't work, and rebuilding, even from nothing, cost less than losing the tourist season for good. The far larger blow came on October 15, 1954, when Hurricane Hazel, a Category 4 storm carrying sustained winds, reported as high as 150 miles per hour, and gusts of 106 miles per hour measured directly in Myrtle Beach, made landfall at the exact moment of the year's highest lunar tide, driving an 18-foot storm surge into a coastline that had never been engineered to withstand one. Hazel killed more than 1,000 people from the Caribbean to Canada and caused roughly $400 million in damage nationally, worth something in the neighborhood of $4.5 billion today. And while South Carolina recorded only a single fatality from the storm, the physical destruction along the Grand Strand was close to total. 80% of the oceanfront structures in Myrtle Beach were destroyed outright, 273 houses gone in the city alone, entire rows of beachfront homes at Cherry Grove and Ocean Drive erased in a single night. A local photographer, out documenting the wreckage the next morning, later described watching a wave crush a bait-and-tackle shop flat, like an egg breaking, though such first-hand recollections, gathered decades after the fact, carry the inevitable softening of memory. The city, rather than retreating from the coastline, doubled down on it, rebuilding with bigger hotels and better construction standards through the late 1950s and 1960s, a decision so consequential that the modern Grand Strand, golf courses and all, is often described by local historians as a direct product of Hazel's destruction rather than something that merely survived it. Nearly 40 years later, the disaster arrived from Washington instead of the Atlantic. On March 31, 1993, Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, home since 1958 to a tactical fighter wing and to roughly 4,000 military and civilian jobs, closed permanently under a federal base realignment order, a casualty of a Pentagon decision to retire the A-10 aircraft the base had flown for decades. A pre-closure economic study projected the loss of more than 5,000 jobs, 1,500 houses dumped onto the local real estate market at once, a 15% drop in public school enrollment, unemployment approaching 20%, and total economic losses topping $91 million, well over $200 million in today's money. Figures that, if they had fully materialized, would have gutted the local economy the way base closures gutted dozens of other American towns through the 1990s. Then, almost immediately afterward, came the slower motion collapse of the golf economy itself, as the same courses that had defined the boom began closing one after another through the recession years of the late 2000s, victims of a supply glut nobody in the industry had planned around. By 2019, the Grand Strand's course count had fallen from its 2002 peak of 114 to 93, an 18% contraction, and closures continued afterward. More than 20 additional courses would eventually shut down, some bulldozed for housing, others simply abandoned to scrub pine and standing water, waiting, in at least one documented case outside the immediate coastline, for a retired resident to keep the fairways mowed with his own equipment for over a decade, in the hope that someone, someday, would reopen it. The single decision that made the ending of the pavilion era inevitable came in March 2006, when Burroughs and Chapin, the same company whose name traced back to the turpentine partnership of 1895 and the Chicago financier who joined it in 1912, announced that the Myrtle Beach Pavilion would close permanently at the end of that season, citing several consecutive years of financial underperformance, even as the surrounding tourism economy kept growing around it. The announcement, framed at the time as a routine business decision about an aging, low-margin asset sitting on some of the most valuable oceanfront land in the state, produced an outcome nobody quite expected. Knowing it was the final season, visitors turned out in record numbers, and the park closed out its 58th year with some of the best attendance and profit figures in its history, a business breaking sales records in the same season its owner had already decided to bury it. The company never framed the decision as a sale in the traditional sense. No outside buyer's name attaches to it, no single purchase price appears in the public record, because the land itself was the asset Burroughs and Chapin actually wanted. An 11-acre amusement park earning modest seasonal ride revenue was, in the company's own math, worth less standing than it would be worth empty, rezoned, and eventually redeveloped into something denser and more profitable. That calculation, reasonable enough on a spreadsheet, is the quiet villain of this story. Not a hurricane, not a base closure memo out of the Pentagon, but a landowner's decision that the ground beneath a beloved public gathering place was more valuable as a blank slate than as itself. The final operating day came on September 24, 2006, with a smaller invitation-only last ride event held 6 days later on September 30th. Almost nobody in Myrtle Beach at the time understood that the empty lot left behind would still be empty 20 years afterward. They left. Not all at once. The pavilion's actual closure took place over a matter of weeks in the fall of 2006. Rides shut down, gates locked, seasonal staff sent home for a final time. But the slower exodus that followed among the small businesses that had depended on the park for foot traffic stretched out for years. Within 2 years of the closure, according to local accounts compiled at the time, nearly every small shop along 9th Avenue North between Ocean Boulevard and Kings Highway had gone dark. T-shirt shops, a former movie theater long since converted into a nightclub, even a McDonald's that had operated in downtown Myrtle Beach since 1984 and had, by some accounts, been the last fast food chain restaurant to survive in the immediate downtown core, closed and briefly reopened as a pizza restaurant before it, too, eventually shut. The population math tells its own version of the story. A city that had been drawing millions of annual visitors through this exact corridor for decades watched its central commercial spine empty out almost entirely within 2 years, even as the broader Grand Strand tourism economy, a few miles in either direction, kept setting records. Photographs taken by local hobbyists in the years immediately after the closure and later archived online by amateur historians show upper-floor nightclub spaces above the old shops sitting exactly as they'd been left. Furniture in place, ceiling tiles intact, decades of accumulated signage still hanging. Because nobody had a reason to renovate space nobody wanted to rent. The pavilion site itself sat behind a chain-link fence through the 2008 and 2009 recession years, a period during which almost nothing happened on the property at all. No demolition crews, no redevelopment announcements, simply 11 acres of quiet in the middle of downtown while the rest of the country's economy, and the Grand Strands along with it, absorbed the worst financial collapse since the Depression. It would be several more years before the area near the old pavilion site began attracting any new investment whatsoever, and even then what arrived was modest and temporary rather than the transformative redevelopment officials had originally promised. An oceanfront boardwalk connecting the old footprint to nearby attractions, sand volleyball courts, and eventually a zip line strung across the empty lot that itself would run for roughly a decade and a half before closing down in 2024, leaving the ground, once again, essentially empty. 2 generations of families who had married, vacationed, and buried relatives around that intersection did not, for the most part, leave Myrtle Beach itself. But the specific physical heart of the town they remembered, the pavilion, the arcade, the dance hall, the rides, was, by any measure, entirely gone. What could be salvaged from the pavilion was salvaged, and what couldn't was demolished for a fraction of what it had cost to build. The Hurricane, a wooden roller coaster that had been one of the park's signature rides, was scrapped almost entirely. Only its steel Gerstlauer-manufactured train cars survived the process, sold off to Kings Island Amusement Park in Ohio for use on a different, unrelated coaster, while the wooden structure itself, along with the haunted hotel dark ride that had entertained 3 decades of visitors, came down piece by piece between February and March of 2007. The lift hill of the coaster finally pulled to the ground on the morning of March 23rd. Demolition crews cleared the Magic Attic building, the arcade, and the rest of the park's structures through the spring, leaving fenced grass lots where 40 attractions had stood a year earlier. In the single most telling detail of the entire liquidation, Burroughs and Chapin, for a short period after the demolition, sold small collector's bags of crushed concrete rubble, literal chunks of the Magic Attic's floor in the pavilion's old Celebrity Walk of Fame, through the company's own retail website, offering ordinary visitors the chance to buy a piece of the building they had just torn down. Not everything was lost outright. The 1912 Herschel-Silman Carousel, considered one of only a handful of its kind still functioning anywhere in the country, along with its German-built Baden-Band organ, first exhibited at the 1900 Paris World's Exposition, were carefully removed and relocated a few miles inland to a new, much smaller amusement park called Pavilion Nostalgia Park, at the Broadway at the Beach shopping and entertainment complex, where they still operate today, run on a paper ride basis rather than the original pavilion's admission model, a preserved fragment of the original park stitched onto a newer commercial development that owns none of its original oceanfront ground. Not every piece of old Myrtle Beach disappeared, and the parts that survived generally did so by understanding something the pavilion's owners eventually stopped believing: that the town's value came from what it actually was, a family-scale beach resort built on cheap, repeatable fun, rather than from what a spreadsheet said the underlying land could become. A few blocks south of the old pavilion site, Family Kingdom Amusement Park, independently owned rather than run by Burroughs and Chapin, has operated continuously on the same oceanfront property since 1966, home to the Swamp Fox, a wooden roller coaster built the same year, making it one of the oldest wooden coasters still running anywhere in the United States. It survived in large part because it never grew large enough, or corporate enough, to be evaluated purely as underused real estate. Pavilion Nostalgia Park, built from the relocated bones of the original park, keeps roughly 15 small rides running today, mostly aimed at younger children, deliberately positioning itself as a throwback to an era before larger regional theme parks existed. And the most significant survivor story in the town's modern history isn't an amusement park at all. It's the former Air Force Base itself. The Myrtle Beach Air Force Base Redevelopment Authority, formally established in September 1994 and led for years by a retired Air Force colonel named Buddy Stiers, spent more than a decade turning the base's 3,900 abandoned acres into an entirely new kind of neighborhood, rather than simply auctioning the land off piecemeal, building walkable streets, a college campus, more than a dozen parks, and a commercial district called the Market Common that finally opened in April 2008. In 2019, the Environmental Protection Agency gave the redevelopment its National Site Reuse Award, crediting the project with roughly $3 billion in cumulative economic activity and more than 6,000 jobs created, several times the 4,000 jobs the original base closure had threatened to erase. Where the pavilion's owners treated a beloved public space as an underperforming asset to be cleared, the redevelopment authority treated an abandoned military installation as raw material for something the town had never had before. A genuine, permanent neighborhood, not just a seasonal attraction, built to last, regardless of who happened to visit that particular summer. Drive Ocean Boulevard today, and the contrasts stack up within a few hundred yards of each other. Just north of 9th Avenue, you pass the Sky Wheel, a 200-foot observation wheel that opened in 2011 roughly, where the Astro Needle once stood, its cabins lit up in slow rotating color at night. A block south, the actual pavilion site is still there behind its fencing, grass mowed but otherwise unused, its zipline towers either removed or standing idle depending on when you happen to pass. Head a few miles inland, and you reach Broadway at the beach, where the relocated 1912 carousel spins for a new generation of children whose grandparents may have ridden the same horse, the same lead horse, on the same original oceanfront ground decades earlier. Continue toward the Market Common, and Ocean Boulevard's downtown decay disappears entirely. Walkable streets named for long-retired base commanders, a movie theater you can reach on foot, restaurants doing steady business, in buildings that occupy the exact footprint of what used to be an active Air Force runway. Drive out past the city limits along any of a dozen secondary roads, and eventually you will pass at least one shuttered golf course, fairways gone soft and overgrown, clubhouse windows boarded, a for sale sign leaning at the entrance where a pro shop sign used to hang. As of the most recent reporting, more than 18 million people still visit the Grand Strand every year, a record by most measures, spending upward of $13 billion annually across more than 150,000 hotel rooms, condos, and vacation rentals combined. And yet, in 2025, even as neighboring Charleston posted its strongest tourism year on record, Myrtle Beach's own visitor numbers dipped slightly, blamed on a soft economy, a rainy summer, and fewer Canadian visitors than the year before. A small, ordinary dip, the kind the town has absorbed 100 times before, except that nobody, watching it happen, can say for certain anymore which dips are ordinary and which ones aren't. Return, one more time, to the corner of 9th Avenue North and Ocean Boulevard. The fence is still there. The grass is still mowed. The music venue proposed in city council briefings in early 2026 remains, as of this telling, a rendering and a mayor's quote, rather than a foundation poured into the sand. 18 million people a year drive, fly, and walk within a few hundred feet of this exact patch of ground, past the spot where a Chicago financier's money once turned worthless timberland into a national resort, past the spot where a wooden coaster once dropped riders into a scream that carried out over Ocean Boulevard, and none of them can tell, just by looking, that this 11-acre gap in an otherwise wall-to-wall resort is the one piece of Myrtle Beach the town itself has never quite decided what to do with, the exact ground where all of it began, and the one spot it has never fully rebuilt.